The story of humanity has always carried echoes from a realm beyond what our eyes can see. When we search the depths of ancient texts and forgotten scrolls, we don't just find tales, we uncover truths that challenge everything we thought we knew. Among these, the Book of Enoch stands as one of the most powerful and revealing records about the origins of evil, the mystery of fallen angels, and a forgotten people whose bloodline stretches across continents and centuries, people of African descent. And when you truly grasp what's hidden within the Book of Enoch, it shakes you to the core. It forces you to rethink who you are, where you come from, and why your struggle is so deep, so spiritual, and so generational. The Book of Enoch, although removed from the traditional biblical canon by many institutions, refuses to be silenced. It carries weight not because it entertains, but because it exposes. It tells the story of the Watchers, angels who descended from heaven and defied divine order. They didn't just rebel, they mingled with humans, passing down forbidden knowledge. They corrupted creation, and from their union with the daughters of men came giants, beings never meant to exist. These were not myths, they were consequences. The world changed. The earth mourned. Blood cried out from the soil. And from that moment, the human story was no longer just physical. It was spiritual warfare. But here's what they don't want you to see. The Book of Enoch doesn't simply talk about the fall of angels. It shines a light on a specific lineage, a people targeted by this rebellion. These weren't just random tribes scattered across the earth. This bloodline carried a divine imprint. This heritage was sacred. The very reason the fallen came was to corrupt it. They saw something precious in this blood, something divine, something unbreakable, and they made it their mission to disrupt it. And it is no coincidence that the earliest civilizations, the greatest wonders of the ancient world, and the richest cultures known to man all point back to Africa. Ethiopia, Nubia, Kemet. This was no accident. This was destiny being written before history was hijacked. Many have wondered why Africa has suffered so much, why a continent so rich in gold, diamonds, culture, and intellect was carved, enslaved, colonized, and demonized. But the question is not why, it's what does it threaten? The bloodline that runs through African veins has always threatened the forces of darkness. Because when your identity is divine, your battle will be spiritual. And when your roots are righteous, your enemies will be relentless. That's why the Watchers came. That's why the Nephilim were born. And that's why the Book of Enoch was buried for so long, because it holds the map back to identity, to truth, to awakening. Enoch wasn't just a man who walked with the divine, he was a recorder of secrets. He was taken because he was too valuable to be lost. His writings speak directly to a generation that would rise in the end times, a generation waking up to the lies, waking up to their calling, waking up to who they really are. This book doesn't just reveal what happened in the past, it speaks directly to now, to you. Because once you realize that the blood in your veins carries the same mark that the fallen tried to taint, you no longer walk with doubt, you walk with purpose, you walk with weight, you walk with power. This knowledge is not about pride, it's about awareness, it's about understanding that your story didn't start in chains. It didn't begin in slavery. It didn't originate in brokenness. It began in holiness, in purpose, in legacy. The chains were placed on your wrist because someone feared what would happen if you were ever truly free. Not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. They knew that if you ever found the truth, systems would fall, thrones would shake, kingdoms built on deception would crumble. Because truth doesn't just set free, it awakens the sleeping giants. The Book of Enoch describes how the fallen angels taught humanity war, weaponry, vanity, seduction, enchantments. These weren't gifts, they were corruption. They were tools used to break down a holy people. They weren't just attacking the body, they were attacking the soul. But even in that rebellion, a remnant remained. Even in that chaos, a people held on. That's why you feel things others. That's why your pain runs deeper, but so does your strength. That's why your history is hidden, but your future is prophesied. That's why your setbacks seem endless, because your comeback is unstoppable. Don't let the world tell you your story began in darkness. The world only benefits from your amnesia. The moment you remember who you are and what you carry, everything changes. You weren't created to survive. You were chosen to lead, to rise, to restore. And the same way Enoch was entrusted with divine mysteries, you too are being handed the scrolls of your identity. And the truth is, your awakening is not just about you. It's about generations that will come through you. Children who won't have to grow up lost. Elders who won't have to die forgotten. It's about bringing back the royalty in your reflection. And as this truth spreads, as more begin to understand what the Book of Enoch really says, not just about the heavens, but about the heritage of those born of African descent, the chains start breaking. Not because someone handed you the key, but because the key was always inside you. You were never just a victim of history. You are the child of a legacy that predates it. Your ancestors didn't just build pyramids. They preserved mysteries. They didn't just survive slavery. They carried prophecy. They didn't just suffer. They sacrificed so that you could be here in this moment, hearing these words, realizing it's not too late to reclaim what was taken. The fallen came to disrupt the divine. They came to counterfeit what was pure. But no matter how deep the corruption ran, the root of righteousness never died. And now, as the world shifts and the veils lift, the remnant is rising. You can feel it. You can sense it. People are waking up not just in churches, not just in temples, but in their hearts, in their blood, in their bones. The pain you feel is not just personal, it's ancestral. The power you hold is not just natural, it's spiritual. You are the living proof that no matter how hard darkness tries to erase light, it can never truly win. So walk boldly in who you are. Don't shrink to fit the lies they told you. Don't hide to make others comfortable. Don't apologize for asking questions that lead to your truth. Because you are not just a name, you are not just a race, you are not just a statistic. You are the result of a divine equation written before the stars were formed. You are the evidence that even fallen angels couldn't destroy destiny. You are the echo of Enoch's vision, the living prophecy of what's to come. And once you step into that truth, there is no turning back. It's time to rise, time to learn, time to teach, time to remember. The fallen may have come to deceive, but you were born to reveal. And now that you know, the responsibility is in your hands. Walk it out with wisdom. Speak it with boldness. Never forget the bloodline they tried to erase is the very one that will rewrite the end of the story. You are chosen. You are rising. And the world is watching. The story of the Watchers in the Book of Enoch is not just about rebellion. It is about intention. These celestial beings, once part of a divine order, did not simply fall out of pride or desire for freedom. Their descent to earth had a calculated purpose. They chose to step out of the heavenly realm with a specific goal in mind, to infiltrate and disrupt something sacred on earth. That something was a bloodline, pure, divine, and powerful. It wasn't coincidence that led the Watchers to cohabit with the daughters of men. It was a deliberate act aimed at dismantling a lineage that carried a direct connection to divine authority. They weren't trying to dominate the earth alone. They were trying to contaminate the spiritual inheritance that had been passed down through generations. This lineage wasn't just spiritual, it was physical. It was embedded in the DNA of a specific people. The ancient lands where this bloodline flourished were in regions we now identify as parts of Africa. The first civilizations, the earliest temples, the oldest scripts, the most profound mysteries, all emerged from this soil, from Ethiopia to Egypt. These places weren't just geographic locations, they were spiritual epicenters. The fallen angels didn't aim to spread chaos everywhere. They focused their corruption where the original harmony had been established. They knew that by altering the essence of the people chosen to carry divine purpose, they could create a ripple effect that would extend for thousands of years. The knowledge they shared of war, sorcery, weaponry, enchantments, vanity was not a gift. It was a tactic. These teachings were foreign to the natural order of humanity. The Watchers didn't come to elevate humanity. They came to sabotage its connection to the divine. They handed humanity tools of destruction under the disguise of wisdom. They planted seeds of division, of ego, of violence, all with the intent of uprooting the legacy of a people whose very existence was a threat to their rebellion. These acts weren't random. These teachings weren't neutral. They were part of a spiritual strategy to dismantle a lineage chosen by divine design. Throughout history, the people whose ancestry traces back to these early lands have endured some of the most relentless suffering: enslavement, colonization, cultural erasure, economic exploitation. None of this is disconnected. It's all part of a historical pattern that began with that first rebellion. Because when you corrupt the root, you affect the fruit. But what the Watchers didn't anticipate was that even in the midst of chaos, the divine spark within this bloodline would not die. It may have been buried, distorted, hidden, but it never disappeared. It continued to beat generation after generation in the hearts of those who carried it. That's why even today there's a spiritual stirring happening among people of African descent. An awakening, a call to remember, to question, to seek. It's not just intellectual curiosity, it's ancestral memory rising. The knowledge that something was taken, that history was rewritten, that identity was manipulated. But even more powerful than the loss is the realization that what was inside them could never be fully destroyed. The Watchers may have introduced corruption, but they could not eliminate destiny. They could not erase the imprint of divinity. Understanding this isn't about glorifying suffering or romanticizing pain. It's about reclaiming clarity. It's about realizing that the struggle has always been more than political, more than economic. It has always been spiritual. Because if the enemy of the divine knew that stopping one bloodline could delay the unfolding of a divine plan, then those who carry that bloodline must understand their worth, their identity, their calling. They are not forgotten. They are not cursed. They are not lost. They are chosen. They are the evidence that truth can survive every attempt to suppress it. The Book of Enoch didn't just tell a story. It preserved a warning. It preserved a blueprint of how darkness tries to manipulate light. It exposed how corruption targets purpose. And more than anything, it showed that some battles are fought not with weapons, but with bloodlines, with the passing down of truth, resilience, and spiritual strength. The Watchers came for a reason, and the legacy they tried to alter still stands as the greatest threat to spiritual wickedness. Because when those who carry divine identity begin to understand it, walk in it, and teach it, the entire system of deception begins to fall apart. The truth about African ancestry was never missing. It was buried. Not by accident, not by ignorance, but by deliberate action. A calculated effort took place over centuries to silence, distort, and erase the story of a people whose roots run deeper than history books are willing to reveal. The identity of those with African bloodlines is not one of loss, it's one of concealment. The world didn't forget Africa's place in the story. It hid it. And the deeper you look, the more you realize that this erasure wasn't just cultural, it was spiritual, because the identity of these people wasn't simply tied to land or lineage. It was tied to something eternal, something sacred, something the powers of darkness wanted hidden, because if it ever resurfaced, the entire narrative of power, history, and spiritual authority would be turned upside down. The Book of Enoch, a text rejected by many mainstream traditions, wasn't discarded because it lacked truth. It was pushed aside because it carried too much of it. It exposed too much. It traced the roots too clearly. And when you follow those roots, they lead back to a land often vilified, misunderstood, and exploited, Africa. But this isn't about geography. It's about legacy. It's about a divine fingerprint placed upon a people long before empires rose and borders were drawn. The knowledge hidden in the Book of Enoch makes it clear that there was a sacred inheritance passed down through generations, an inheritance that those in power worked endlessly to keep buried. This was not done through mere silence. It was achieved through rewriting, through substitution, through demonization. Traditions were stolen, rituals were renamed, and images were altered. Sacred knowledge became forbidden. The holy became heathen. And those who once sat on thrones of wisdom were labeled as primitive. The shift didn't just happen in books, it happened in minds. Generations grew up seeing themselves through a lens that was never theirs. Their story was told by strangers who had no interest in preserving its truth. And over time, that lie became tradition. It became normal. It became accepted. But lies don't erase truth, they only delay it. The truth buried under centuries of deception is rising. It's surfacing not through institutions, but through personal awakenings, through visions, dreams, research, and inner knowing. People across the world, especially those connected to African heritage, are beginning to question what they've been taught. They're beginning to ask why their contributions to civilization have been minimized, why their spiritual systems were demonized, why their history begins with chains instead of crowns. And the answer is becoming clearer with every revelation, because their true story threatens the entire structure of deception that has ruled the world for too long. The Book of Enoch reveals more than fallen angels and forbidden knowledge. It reveals why certain groups were targeted, why their names were erased from scrolls, why their gods were replaced, why their tongues were silenced. It wasn't random. It was a war, one not fought with swords, but with silence, with shadows, with the erasure of identity. Because if a people forget who they are, they forget what they carry. They forget their authority. They forget their place in the divine plan. And when that happens, they become easy to control. Not because they lack power, but because they no longer believe they have it. That's why reclaiming identity is more than cultural. It's revolutionary. To remember the truth is to break the system. To rediscover divine heritage is to dismantle the structures that were built to oppress. This awakening isn't just about pride in where you come from. It's about restoration. It's about recognizing that the knowledge you were denied wasn't irrelevant. It was essential. That the spiritual systems rooted in your ancestry weren't evil. They were powerful. That the very same qualities used to enslave you, your strength, your faith, your resilience, are the same ones that have preserved your truth. And now that truth is refusing to stay buried. It's being spoken in classrooms, whispered in homes, preached in corners where institutions never dared to look. People are rising with the understanding that their story didn't begin with colonization. It began with divine purpose. The ancient wisdoms are being revived. The old scrolls are being read. The long-forgotten names are being called again. And the voices that were silenced are now thundering through generations, reminding the world of a truth it tried to erase. African identity was never broken. It was hidden. But now it's coming back stronger than ever, because no lie can hold back a people whose time to awaken has come.
The battle that has raged across centuries was never truly about territory, material wealth, or political control. It has always run deeper than that. The war has been for the essence of humanity, the spirit, the soul, and most critically, the bloodline. Among all the peoples of the earth, there is one whose lineage has been marked by an unusual level of pressure, distortion, and resistance. That bloodline has not only endured physical attacks, but spiritual ones, because its existence threatens to awaken a knowledge that would shake the very foundations of deception that have controlled the world for generations. It's not just about color or continent. It's about a divine imprint that has been feared from the beginning of time. The fallen beings who descended into the earth knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't come to destroy everything. They came for something specific. They came for the line that carried within it the code of divine purpose, and much of that code was carried through African blood. They saw that this people, scattered yet spiritually aligned, carried a rhythm, a vibration, a connection that could not be broken by force alone. Their traditions, languages, rituals, and wisdom echoed ancient truths that predated empires. They moved with power, they remembered the skies, they walked in harmony with creation, and they spoke with the voice of the earth. This wasn't superstition, it was sacred memory. That's what made them dangerous to the forces that feed off confusion and lies. Because once you know who you are no longer controllable. Once you awaken to your purpose, no chain can hold you. That's why the battle had to be fierce. That's why the system had to be thorough. Not only to dominate them physically, but to keep them mentally detached from who they truly are. And the fallen feared that the most, not the might of a sword or the number of people gathered, but the awakening of one who knows their identity, one who sees beyond the illusion. Because once the truth is activated in even a small part of the body, it begins to spread. It begins to awaken others. The world has seen the evidence of this fear throughout time. How heavily Africa and its children have been targeted by spiritual, psychological, and political warfare. From invasions to colonization, from slavery to systemic oppression, it was never just about control. It was about containment. It was about suppressing something ancient, something divine, something unstoppable once fully recognized. That's why the world tries so hard to define African descendants through struggle, through lack, through brokenness. Because if they were ever allowed to see their story through the lens of divine calling rather than trauma, the narrative would collapse. The systems would lose their grip. And that is the greatest threat to the fallen agenda, truth spreading through bloodlines. Once a generation begins to ask the right questions, once they begin to remember what was passed down in silence, once they begin to uncover what was stripped from them, the illusion begins to crack. The enemy knew that time was a threat, that with each new generation the fire would grow, that eventually the calling couldn't be ignored. You carry that very fire. It's why you felt out of place in a system built on falsehood. It's why you've questioned what you were taught about your history. It's why your spirit never fully accepts the idea that your ancestors were simply victims of chance. Because deep down, something inside you remembers. Remembers royalty, remembers purpose, remembers walking with divine presence. And even if the world forgot, your blood didn't. Your cells didn't. Your spirit didn't. The memory has always been there, waiting to be activated, waiting for truth to touch it and awaken it again. The pressure you feel, the obstacles you face, the voices that try to distract you, they're not coincidences. They're evidence of your importance. The enemy doesn't fight what isn't a threat. The enemy doesn't steal from what isn't valuable. The intensity of the attack is a reflection of the magnitude of what you carry. You weren't meant to blend in, to be silenced, to live without knowing your meaning. You were born with a call tied to something greater than the material world. You were born from a line the fallen couldn't erase. A line that survived being scattered, enslaved, and misnamed, and still remembers its place. And now it's no longer about survival. It's about recognition, about rising, about reclaiming what was stolen without shame. Not for revenge, but for restoration. Not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. Because when you rise in truth, others rise with you. When you stand in your calling, lies begin to fall. And the very same blood that was targeted becomes the very thing that brings down systems built on deception. That's the legacy you hold. That's the reason for the war. That's why you were born into this time. To remember, to speak, to rise, and to lead others to do the same. The writings attributed to Enoch were not lost. They were safeguarded. They weren't misplaced by chance, but hidden from public view for a reason far greater than preservation. They carried information that could awaken the minds of generations, particularly those whose spiritual inheritance was interrupted by conquest, colonization, and control. The Book of Enoch did not simply vanish from accepted teachings. It was excluded because of what it revealed, truths that hold the power to disrupt every constructed lie. Its words speak with clarity, not just about the heavens and the rebellion that took place beyond earth, but about the unfolding of events that were to be witnessed by a people who would carry the memory of their purpose, even through forced forgetfulness.
The rediscovery of this text is not accidental. It coincides with the very age in which minds are being stirred, voices are being raised, and identities are being remembered by those who were long disconnected from their original story. There comes a point in time when what has been suppressed can no longer remain buried. What has been hidden for ages begins to surface, not by the efforts of institutions or scholars alone, but through the internal call heard by those who have always sensed there was more to their existence than they were told. The rise of awareness among people of African descent is part of a process that the Book of Enoch anticipated. This awakening isn't just about uncovering facts. It's not just about history. It's about recognition of divine timing. The text speaks not just to the past, but to the end of an era when truth will return to those who were chosen to carry it. And now that the time has come, the stirring in the spirit cannot be ignored. Those who were told they were nothing are realizing they were everything the system feared. The power of Enoch's words lies in their ability to activate something that was never fully lost, just silence. His writings were always meant to resurface at a specific moment in the human timeline, when the minds of the scattered would begin to remember their strength. The patterns are no longer deniable. The people once stripped of language, land, and legacy are now reclaiming their voice. The very ones who were told to forget are now becoming the ones who carry remembrance. This kind of awakening doesn't come from outside influences. It comes from a divine push that burns within the soul. It pushes individuals to seek, to question, to look beyond the surface of everything they've been shown. What's remarkable is that those awakening now were never taught to connect with this book. They were never encouraged to read it, yet they find themselves drawn to its content, as if something long buried inside them is suddenly coming alive again. That's not coincidence, it's alignment. Enoch's writings contain truths that resonate most deeply with those whose lives and lineages have experienced the greatest disconnect from divine recognition. Those who have endured cycles of erasure, forced identity, and spiritual manipulation are now seeing the pieces come back together. It's not just a return to knowledge, it's a return to themselves. This moment is a fulfillment of the very things hidden within the words of Enoch. A moment when veils are being lifted and chains broken. Not physical chains, but mental and spiritual ones. It is not about sensationalism. It is not about conspiracy. It is about clarity. It's about hearing the unspoken and feeling the unexplainable until it becomes undeniable. People across nations are beginning to sense that they are part of something greater than what the world describes. They are not rediscovering a myth. They are stepping into a truth that was always theirs. They are not seeking outside themselves for value. They are realizing the value has always been inside. As the spirit awakens, the confusion fades. The separation once used as a tool of domination is becoming less effective, because when those who were torn from their roots begin to trace those roots back, not to the narratives given to them but to the source itself, they find power waiting for them. The Book of Enoch becomes more than text. It becomes confirmation. Confirmation that their suffering had purpose, that their journey was watched, that their rising was always part of the greater plan. The fallen sought to interrupt the divine, but they could not erase it. This return is not about going back in time. It's about moving forward with knowledge that was withheld for generations. It's about standing firm in an identity that doesn't depend on validation from the world. It's about knowing that you are not awakening by mistake, but by design. The rediscovery of Enoch's words is part of that design. A design meant to realign what was once broken and remind those who had forgotten just how powerful they truly are. When a person comes to the realization of who they truly are, something shifts, not just in their mind, but in their entire existence. It's as if the chains that were invisible suddenly become clear, and just as quickly they begin to loosen. This is not because someone handed them a key, but because they remembered they were never locked in the first place. The most powerful form of control has never been physical. It has always been mental, and once the mind begins to wake up, the soul follows. This awakening doesn't shout. It doesn't announce itself with noise. It rises quietly, persistently, with undeniable force. It changes how a person sees themselves, how they walk, how they speak, and how they move through a world that once convinced them they were small. This understanding of identity has been the very thing feared by systems designed to control. Because once someone becomes aware of the truth of their origin, they can no longer be manipulated by lies. When a person discovers they come from greatness, from divine design, from a story that predates conquest and colonization, their entire framework of belief begins to evolve. They no longer seek validation from structures that were never built with them in mind. They stop measuring their worth by standards that were created to exclude them. They no longer try to fit into definitions that were never meant to honor them. Instead, they begin to rise. Not because they're becoming something new, but because they're returning to something eternal. That return is powerful. It's silent but seismic. It alters generations not by force but by revelation. And when even one person in a family begins to walk in that truth, a ripple effect begins. The way they raise their children changes. The stories they tell shift. The standards they live by rise. And that shift spreads not just in bloodlines but in communities. It becomes contagious. The most extraordinary revolutions don't always begin with crowds. They begin with clarity, and that clarity starts within. No sword, no law, no institution can stand against someone who knows who they are and who they were always meant to be. This is why identity was targeted for so long, why entire cultures were forced to forget their names, their languages, their traditions, why generations were raised to believe their history started in chains, because if you can control how someone sees themselves, you can shape how they live. If you can convince them they are broken, you don't have to break them. They will do it themselves. But when that illusion fades and they begin to see their reflection for what it truly is, not distorted by centuries of lies, but revealed through ancestral memory and divine truth, they rise with a strength that cannot be manufactured or destroyed. This awakening isn't just personal, it's ancestral. It is the voice of those who came before, echoing through those who live now. It is the fulfillment of prayers whispered in dark places, carried through time by the will to survive. It is the answer to every effort that was made to silence, erase, and destroy. It is the realization that their survival was not just resilience, it was prophecy. The return to identity is not about superiority, it's about healing. It's about reclaiming what was always yours. Not through war, but through wisdom. Not through dominance, but through awareness. When you know who you are, you don't have to shout it, you live it. And as more begin to walk in this truth, entire systems built on deception begin to lose their power. The moment a person no longer believes the lie loses its grip. It becomes hollow, powerless. That is what the awakening does. It empties the fear. It removes the fog. It brings light to places that were buried in shadow. It doesn't require approval. It doesn't seek permission. It arrives with certainty, with quiet authority, with unshakable presence. It reminds you that you were never lost. You were only hidden, and now that you're found, everything begins to shift. This is the kind of freedom no law can offer, the kind no government can promise. It's not given by institutions, it's revealed through inner remembrance. It is a revolution of the soul, a return to truth that reshapes generations. And once it starts, it cannot be stopped. Because when even one spark of truth is lit in the heart, it has the power to ignite everything around it. And in that light, no chain can remain. No lie can last. No force can hold back the movement of those who finally remember who they've always been.